Hi, this is Dr. Golding. We're going to talk today about Thomas Hobbes, who lived from 1588 to 1679, and we're going to talk about his theory of ethics. Before we get to his theory of ethics, a little bit of a background on Thomas Hobbes. First of all, Thomas Hobbes is considered to be a modern philosopher, and part of that means that he was not under the same hold that someone like Thomas Aquinas was from Christianity. Also, Hobbes was less under the influence of Aristotle, as you remember that Aquinas agreed a lot with Aristotle. And so we're going to see that Hobbes rejects some of the fundamental assumptions or beliefs that Aristotle had, not just about human beings, but about the world. And so Hobbes is coming at ethics from a very different perspective than any of the philosophers that we've studied before. So we're going to talk about some background beliefs or fundamental assumptions that Hobbes has about the world and about the human being. And I'm going to list three important concepts on the board here. We're going to talk about materialism, we're going to talk about mechanism, and these two things kind of go together. And also we're going to talk about how Hobbes rejected teleology. So we'll just call that anti-teleology. Okay, so first of all, materialism in this context, we've used that term before, but for Hobbes, what we mean by saying that Hobbes is a materialist is that basically Hobbes believes that everything that exists in the universe is made up of physical matter. The only things that exist in the entire universe are physical objects or bodies that take up space, and of course they move. So there's material objects and there are motions of those material objects. So basically that's what materialism means here. Everything that exists is physical. There are no non-physical beings or entities. So right away you can see from that Hobbes is not going to agree with, let's say, Plato's theory of the forms, because if you remember, the forms are non-physical entities. Also, if we have a soul at all, it's going to have to be something physical. So therefore, Hobbes does not believe in a non-physical soul. Now we have a soul, obviously, in some sense. Remember, the word soul in Greek is psyche. We have some kind of consciousness. We have some kind of a force within us that is somehow our life force, our mind. But whatever it is, according to Hobbes, it's got to be some kind of physical entity, or it has to do with some motions of the physical parts that are in our bodies or in our brain or nervous system. Let's move down to mechanism here. The idea of mechanism is that, let's put it this way, the world, and indeed anything in the world, let's say a human being, something in the world, is basically a very complicated, well, in the case of the human being, a complicated machine. Okay, in other words, it's an entity that has physical parts, and anything that goes on in that entity, the human being, has to be explained through understanding the motions of the parts and why they're doing what they're doing, in the same way that, for example, you would explain what's going on in a car. Like, obviously, I think all of us would agree that a car is a physical thing, and if something's wrong with the car, we seek to explain that by talking about the motions of the parts inside not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so the human being is a physical entity made up of physical parts that are moving. And if we want to talk about, let's say, human activity, human action, human thought, desire, whatever it is, if we want to explain why humans are doing what they're doing, we need to explain human behavior in the same way that we would explain, let's say, the workings of a complicated machine. That's basically what mechanism means. The world is a sort of complicated machine, and individual organisms within that world, such as the human being, animals, trees, whatever, all things in the world can be explained in terms of mechanistic principles. The same way that you would explain the behavior of a machine, that's how you would explain the behavior of a human being. We'll get into a few more details about what's going on with that, but that's the basic idea of mechanism. Now, anti-teleology. Remember that according to Aristotle and according to Aquinas, they believed in something called teleology. We talked about this at length. And that's the idea that everything in the universe has some kind of a goal or telos that is suited to the nature of that thing. Well, basically, Hobbes rejects that. Now, what Hobbes does believe in is causation. So causation is something that Hobbes does believe in. There is such a thing as cause and effect. So for example, Hobbes would agree that, if you take an apple seed and you put it in the ground and you water it, and there's enough sunshine, then it's going to cause the apple seed to start sprouting and spreading forth some branches and leaves, and eventually it's probably going to become an apple tree with beautiful blossoming flowers and fruit. Okay? But that's causation. There isn't a goal or end that is somehow suited to the nature of the thing. What's going to happen to the apple seed is going to depend on what effects or what events or what forces impinge on that seed and make it do whatever it does. So if you take the apple seed and you flush it down the toilet, it's not going to become an apple tree. If you take an apple seed and put it in a test tube and spray it with chemicals, then who knows what's going to happen to it. There's no goal or end that is suited to the nature of the thing. It's just rather that depending upon what causes and effects, depending upon what you do to the apple seed, it's going to either become an apple tree or it might become just a piece of junk in someone's backyard. So the same thing is going to apply to human beings. According to Hobbes, we human beings, we're subject to cause and effect. So certain things are going to influence us to do certain things. We have certain biological drives. We're going to talk a little bit more about that soon. There's certain biological drives that we have that are going to make us or lead us to do certain things, such as eat, drink, procreate. But there's no goal or end or telos that is somehow suited to our nature. And therefore, since there's no teleology, we cannot use the teleological approach to ethics. If you remember when we talked about Aristotle and Aquinas, we said that they have a teleological approach to ethics. There's a goal, there's somehow an end that is suited to the nature of the human being. And virtue is going to consist in developing those character traits that will allow us to reach our telos. Well, obviously, if we don't have a telos, then we cannot use the teleological approach to ethics. We have to find some other theory of what virtue or ethics is about. And so that's what Hobbes is going to do, provide a theory of ethics which does not depend on teleology and does not depend on the notion of a soul. Remember how important that was for, let's say, someone like Plato, three parts of the soul, happiness of the soul. Well, Hobbes dismisses all that essentially, and therefore we have to look for a different theory of ethics according to Hobbes. So, what is Hobbes's theory of ethics? Well, let's give you the basic overall important point about what Hobbes's theory of ethics is, and then we'll sort of work backward to understand how he supports his theory. So the most important thing you need to know about Hobbes's theory of ethics, and this has become a very famous theory of ethics that many philosophers to this very day believe in, and it's called the social contract theory. Social contract. The social contract theory of ethics basically says as follows: human beings living together in this world need to mutually agree to abide by certain rules in order for us to live decent, more or less happy lives. Okay? Basically, what Hobbes says is that human beings, in what he calls the natural condition, okay? In the natural condition of mankind, that is a term that he uses, the natural condition. Okay, so in the natural condition, imagine what the natural condition means is you imagine human beings just living without any government, without any system of law and order. Basically, I like to think of it as the jungle condition. Life in the jungle. Imagine you're in some place where there are human beings living, but there's no police, there's no government, there's no laws, there's no courts, there's no prisons. It's just human beings living together and doing whatever they please to do. Now, you can easily imagine that in that situation, life is going to be very, very difficult. And Hobbes really goes to town on this. If you read, as I'd like you to do, please read his discussion, his description of life in the natural condition. Hobbes says that life in the natural condition would be very, very awful. We'll get into some more details about why, but think about that on your own if you like, why life would not be very pleasant in the natural condition. In order to get out of the natural condition, human beings need to mutually agree, and that's what the word the word contract means to make an agreement of some sort, right? When you make a contract, you're making an agreement. So Hobbes's theory is that human beings, in order to escape the awful natural condition, are going to agree to abide by certain rules. And essentially, that's what ethics or morality is. The moral rules, and we're going to get into some more detail about what specifically those rules are, but they're going to end up including things like don't murder, don't steal. The moral rules are those rules which we would all agree to mutually in order to escape the natural condition. Now, Hobbes adds something very, very important. It's not enough to just agree to abide by certain rules. We need also to agree to impose upon ourselves a government, or what Hobbes calls a sovereign. A sovereign is some kind of a ruler who is going to enforce through threat of punishment, obedience to those rules. Okay, because according to Hobbes, it's just not going to work. If people just say, hey, I'm going to agree to abide by certain rules, but there's no power or force that is going to make sure that people do abide by those rules. So basically what Hobbes says is that without some kind of threat or fear of punishment, people are not going to abide by the rules whenever they can get away with it. Okay? So therefore, to put this in terms of a slogan, we would say that according to Hobbes, morality and politics go together. Morality and politics go hand in hand. You can't have morality without a government in place that enforces those rules. Okay, because without the enforcer, there's no guarantee that people are going to abide by the rules, and then there's really not much reason for any individual to abide by the rules as long as other people aren't abiding by the rules. Okay, so that's the overview. Social contract, the laws of morality, the rules of morality are those rules that we would mutually agree to in order to escape the natural condition. Now we're going to back up a little bit and talk a little bit more about what is sometimes called Hobbes's psychology. And this goes back to something we talked about before with materialism and mechanism. So, like we said before, Hobbes thinks that the human being is basically a physical creature made up of physical parts and the motions of those parts. Okay, so when it comes to action, when it comes to doing something, Hobbes thinks that human beings are basically going to be motivated to do stuff because of a force within us that is called desire. Okay, desire, according to Hobbes, desire is like a physical force or power within us that involves the motions of little parts within, let's say, the nervous system or the brain or various parts of the body. And those motions can cause other motions, which then will, let's say, lead us to actually do something. And basically, there are two versions or two forms of desire. There is what's called appetite and aversion. I hope you can see this on the board here. Appetite and aversion. In other words, if we think of desire as a kind of motion, appetite is when you have a motion that's leading you towards something, okay? So like, for example, let's suppose you're thirsty and there's a glass of water on the table. So Hobbes is going to say, well, there's some kind of motion inside your body that is leading to more motions and other motions, and finally that leads you to actually get up and or reach your arm across the table, pick up the glass of water and drink it. So your action of drinking a glass of water is a result of some kind of power or force within you leading you to do something or pursue something. That's basically appetite. It's a motion toward some object. On the other hand, aversion is a motion that leads you away from something. Okay, so for example, if a rabid dog jumps into the room and is barking and it's licking its chops and it's coming towards you, so you're going to probably feel a motion inside of you that leads you away from the dog, okay? So that would be aversion. Aversion is essentially a motion that is leading you away from something. And appetite is a motion that's leading you towards something. I mean, when you think about motion, motion is either going that way or going that way. Now, there is something else that could happen, which is you could have what Hobbes refers to as contempt. Now, contempt, what he means by contempt is when you have neither emotion towards something nor emotion away from it. Like, for example, let's suppose somebody puts I don't know, let's say, for me, let's say someone puts a plate of tofu on the table. Well, I'm not particularly interested in eating tofu. I don't feel any emotion toward the tofu, but it's not like a rabid dog. I mean, I'm not, that much against tofu that I want to flee from it. Okay, now if it were something stinky and smelly, someone put something that was like really disgusting on the table, I might have some aversion to it and then I'd be led back away from it. That wouldn't be contempt anymore. Contempt is when you neither have emotion toward the thing, nor do you have emotion away from the thing. Okay? Because basically, if you think about motion, if you think about an object, a physical object, either it's going to be moving in one way, or it's going to be moving in another way, or it's going to be standing still, right? So again, this is all part of Hobbes's materialism, because he thinks of the human being as an entity made of physical parts, and therefore, if we're made of physical parts and the motions of those parts, anything we do is going to have to be explained in the same way that we would explain, let's say, why is an elevator going to floor 2? Well, it's because somebody pressed number 2, and that causes the motions inside the elevator to go to floor 2, right? So similarly with a human being, if we're choosing to do something, it's because there's a motion within us leading toward it. If we're choosing to go away from something, it's because there's a motion leading us away from that thing. And if we're neither going toward it nor away from it, that must mean that we are, the motions inside of us are just sort of stable and stationary. Okay, so based on this concept, Hobbes then goes on to make a very important statement, which you can find in your text. I'll try to get you the page number later on. Maybe it's a good little assignment for you to see if you can find the following passage that I'm going to talk about in a second in the chapter on Hobbes. Hobbes makes a very important statement about good and evil. Of course, these are moral terms, right? Good and evil. And here's what Hobbes says about good and evil. Basically, Hobbes says that whatever a person has a desire for, whatever a person has an appetite for, he or she will call that good. And whatever they have an aversion for, they are going to call evil or bad. If it's something that I am disgusted by, moving away from, I have an aversion to, I'm going to say, bad. Like, for example, if someone puts a smelly, stinky piece of who knows what on the table, I'm saying bad. On the other hand, if someone puts a piece of nice, juicy steak or maybe some barbecue chicken on the table, I'm going to say, that's good. I'm moving toward that thing. And of course, if somebody puts something neutral that I neither like nor don't like, let's say tofu, I'm not particularly excited about it, but I don't necessarily flee from it, then I'm going to say that's neither good nor bad. Hobbes goes on to say that there is nothing in the nature of things that is inherently good or bad. Rather, like we said before, If we like it, we call it good. If we don't like it, we call it bad or evil. I'm using the terms evil and bad interchangeably over here, okay? So this view that Hobbes has about good and evil, or good and bad, is, we have a name for this view, it's called subjectivism, okay? Remember, we've talked about this before. It seems like we could say that Hobbes believes in subjectivism. Hobbes is a subjectivist about good and bad. There's nothing that is inherently good in and of itself. Rather, if I like it, I call it good, and if I don't like it, I call it bad. Now, obviously, that means that if you like something that I don't like, let's say you like tofu, and I hate it, I'm going to call it bad, you're going to call it good. There's nothing inherently in the tofu that is good or bad. It's all a matter of the person. If they like it, they call it good. If they don't like it, they call it bad. So, but Hobbes isn't talking about tofu only, or roast chicken, or food. Hobbes is making a general statement that good and bad are subjective. Their usage depends upon the person, and there's nothing inherently good or bad about anything. Now, of course, this represents a disagreement with definitely Plato, because remember, Plato claimed that there is such a thing as the good. According to Plato, the good is inherently that which is good, right? It's not just good because I like it or don't like it. The good is essentially good, and Aquinas would make the same claim about God, right? According to Aquinas, God is inherently perfect. Whether we like it or don't like it, whether we recognize it or don't recognize it, according to Aquinas, God is essentially good. So therefore, at the very least, we can say that Hobbes disagrees with Plato and with Aquinas, because Hobbes believes in subjectivism, as opposed to the opposite of that is what we called objectivism, right? So we already see that Hobbes is very different from the previous philosophers that we have studied. Now, in addition, many people think, and here I'm not so sure I agree with this, but a lot of people think that Hobbes believes in psychological egoism. Do you remember we used the term psychological egoism before? Excuse me one second. Just picking up my eraser that I dropped on the floor. So let's just go back to psychological egoism for a minute. You'll remember, I think, that psychological egoism is the view that human beings by nature are selfish, self-interested, that everything we do for ourselves. Okay, now, if you think about Hobbes's psychology, all right, in other words, the human being is basically a physical creature made up of physical parts, and everything that we do is because of the motions of those parts. So basically, I'm going to be motivated to do whatever I desire to do, right? And if there's those motions in if those little motions inside me are leading me to do something, then I'm going to do them, do whatever the action is. And if the motions of the parts are leading me away from something, then that's what I'm going to do. Now, does that mean that I am inherently going to do only what is in my self-interest? Well, you might say, yeah, because the motions within me are going to lead me to do whatever the hell I want to do, okay? And if those motions aren't there, I'm not going to do them. So it seems like I'm kind of hardwired. My nature is such that physically I'm going to do that which is that which I want to do, which is going to be in my interest. Okay. I'm not so sure that Hobbes it couldn't say, well, there might be certain motions in my body that lead me to do things that really are not in my own interest or don't necessarily support my own welfare. Yes, I'm going to be motivated to do whatever I do because of the motions within me that lead to other motions, that lead to other motions, that lead me to do something. But it's not impossible that I couldn't have some series of motions within myself that lead me to do something that actually benefits somebody else and doesn't really benefit me. That's possible. However, we do know that according to Hobbes, one of the most important motivations, desires that we have, and here's in a way where he agrees with something in what that we saw in Thomas Aquinas, is that the most powerful force or drive within the human being is the drive for self-preservation. Okay? Self-preservation is, the drive to live, the drive to survive. I don't want to die. It does seem that Hobbes believed that our most important or most powerful force that we are governed by is the desire to avoid death. So that's something that is going to motivate a lot of what we do. And that's something that's we perceive to be in our self-interest. We don't want to die, right? And a lot of what we do is in order to fulfill that is driven by the desire for self-preservation, which is certainly something that is in our self-interest, because without life, we don't have anything at all, right? Okay, so let's just say, according to Hobbes, is it possible that somebody might be motivated to do something that is not in their self-interest? It's possible, but for the most part, Hobbes is going to say humans are driven by their desires. The primary desire is the desire for self-preservation, and we're going to, in general, be driven by that desire pretty thoroughly. Okay? Now, based on these sort of assumptions or background views about the human being, Hobbes then begins to talk about the natural condition, which I mentioned before. So we're going to go back to that now, the natural condition. Hobbes says that life in the natural condition would be horrible. Again, what is the natural condition? The condition that we would all be in if there were no government, no law and order, no courts, no police, just, like I said, the jungle condition. Now, why is life so horrible in that situation? Well, basically, what you have is that humans are motivated to do what is in their self-interest. Even if it's not 100% of the time, basically that's what humans are going to do. Hobbes believes that, in general, resources are going to be scarce. What that simply means is that, if you imagine a bunch of human beings living together in some place, if there's, let's say, just wild fruit growing on trees and there's an abundance of resources, then, actually people might get along pretty nicely. But in general, you're going to find that resources are scarce. So humans are going to compete. So competition for scarce resources is generally going to lead human beings to fight and to engage in battle and war with one another. In addition, Hobbes believed that human beings suffer from, let's call it, vainglory. Vainglory is a kind of old-fashioned way of saying vanity. Human beings, and this is where kind of we see Hobbes has a sort of, let's say, pessimistic outlook on the nature of the human being. That Hobbes thinks that human beings are vain. We don't like it when we see that other people have more than us. It tends to make us jealous, and we want to get at those people and cut them down to size or find some way of showing that we're better than them. Okay, Hobbes thinks that this is just part of human nature. We have the need to survive, and not only that, but we are not happy when we see other people having more than us. We tend to be greedy, and of course we tend to be selfish. Now, and of course on top of that, we want to survive at all costs. Okay, so in the natural condition, we're going to be very competitive, and if there's no law and order, we're going to be killing and stealing, unfortunately. There's another important factor, which is what Hobbes refers to as diffidence. Diffidence is a word that simply means lack of confidence, okay? In other words, let's suppose I'm a pretty easygoing guy by nature. Let's suppose I'm not really a violent kind of person. I don't like getting into fights. I really don't like, let's say, taking other people's stuff. I'd rather not do that. The problem is that in the natural condition, because there is no government and there's no law and order and there's no guarantee of peace and security, so that means that I am going to be living in a state of fear all the time, pretty much. I can't really go to bed at night and sleep tight because with no law and order, no government, no police, other people out there might be coming after me in the middle of the night to take my stuff and possibly kill me. So therefore, I have to kind of go on the offensive, even though if I'm not necessarily a violent type of person or a bloodthirsty person. Basically, the law of the jungle, there really is no law in the jungle. That's the point. In the jungle, there's no law and order. But if we can use this little phrase sort of metaphorically, the law of the jungle is shoot first, ask questions later. You probably heard this phrase before. Shoot first, ask questions later. What does that mean? Shoot first, ask questions later. Well, it simply means that if I'm in a situation where there's no law and order, and let's suppose I see somebody coming toward my, in the jungle. Let's suppose I've managed to build some kind of hut, and I have my wife and my kids in there, and I see a stranger approaching, like in the Wild Wild West, for example, if you've ever seen, movies about the Wild Wild West. No law and order, every man for himself. If I see some strangers approaching me, I'm going to be afraid, and I'm going to shoot first, ask questions later, because if I wait and see, oh, maybe these guys are friendly, maybe they're just here asking directions, maybe they just want to sit down and have a cup of coffee, yeah, maybe, but what if they want to kill me and kill my family or steal my stuff? So in the jungle, even those people who would prefer not to be violent end up having to be violent because of the fear that other people might be violent, other people might be coming to attack them. I'm going to shoot first and ask questions later, and that's kind of my right. In fact, Hobbes says that in the natural condition, every man has a natural right. Maybe we'll talk more in detail about this concept next time. But in the natural condition, we have a natural right to do whatever we feel we need to do in order to advance our own life and our own interests. Okay? So we'll come back to the notion of a natural right next time. But for now, let's get back to the natural condition is awful because we are self-interested, because we need to compete over scarce resources, because we are somewhat vain, or actually according to Hobbes, by nature we are vain and don't like to see other people doing better than us. We are going to be, in the natural condition, what Hobbes says, it's a condition of the war of every man against every other man. It's complete chaos, it's unpleasant, it's horrible, and in a very famous quote, Hobbes says that life in the natural condition would be, and I'll put this on the board, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, meaning your life would be short because you're probably going to die relatively young. Now, there's another thing about the natural condition that's important to mention. Because of the insecurity, because of the lack of peace, because of the lack of confidence, therefore, there is no industry, there's no luxuries, there is no commerce. If you think about, let's say, a modern society where you have, you can go to the mall and you can walk around the mall and buy things. You can go to Kroger's and walk around and buy stuff. If you're a farmer, you can, sow a field with crops, and over a long period of time, eventually, you're going to reap the field from its crops. Okay, well, all of those kinds of things are only possible when you have law and order, when you have peace and security, when you have regulations, when you have some kind of recourse to what happens if somebody comes into my field and steals my crops, or what happens if someone goes into the store and takes stuff and just walks out without paying. Well, you call the cops. Well, in a situation where there's no cops, where there's no government, where there's no police, where there's no punishment for crimes, none of that industry and commerce is possible. Okay, so in the natural condition, not only is life short, but it's also nasty and brutish. There's no culture, there's no high civilization. Life is not only violent, life is also very brutal and very basic. You don't have, you won't have, let's say, electric companies. You won't have running water. You won't have sewers. You're going to be living in a really, like in the jungle, you're going to be living in very primitive conditions. It's going to be very unpleasant. So life in the natural condition is extremely unpleasant, brutal, awful. We need to do something to get out of the natural condition. And next time we're going to talk about how, according to Hobbes, what we do is we make some kind of an agreement to give up some of our natural rights and impose upon ourselves what he's going to call certain natural laws, and also impose upon ourselves a sovereign, a ruler, who is going to enforce obedience to those rules so that we can escape the natural condition. What I'd like you to think about until next time is, do you agree or disagree with Hobbes's assumptions? Do you think that, well, first of all, what do you think about materialism, mechanism, anti-teleology? What do you think about his assumptions about, or his fundamental beliefs about the human being? Do you think that the human being is basically a physical creature made up of physical bodies and the motions of those parts? One thing that is important to add, and we'll talk about this again more next time, is that Hobbes does think that human beings are rational. we have reason, we have understanding, and we're going to use our brain, use our rational abilities to figure out a way out of the natural condition. So reason is going to play a role in how we get to ethics. But think about also whether you agree with Hobbes's account of the natural condition. Would it be so horrible? Would it be so awful? And I think that we've done a lot with Hobbes for today, and look forward to another video for next time. Be well.